Jeremy Corbyn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, and he quite rightly drew attention to the huge losses of Russian troops in this conflict and, of course, equally huge numbers of losses on the Ukrainian side. Does he see any prospect, after the unsuccessful attempts at a ceasefire over Easter, of anyone else intervening to try and bring about talks between Russia and Ukraine that could lead to a lasting ceasefire, that could lead ultimately to a settlement? Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, tried to intervene, as did the African Union and a number of Latin American leaders. This war cannot go on forever. There has to be somebody intervening to try and bring about a process that will lead to a ceasefire and thus no more loss of the tragic loss of so many people's lives.
Secretary of State.
Well, the right honourable gentleman is right. This has to end. It has to end in a process that can lead to a political and negotiated settlement. My view and the government's view is that the best chance of that, the momentum behind the negotiations at the moment that are American-led, are what we need to throw our weight behind and try and ensure can succeed.
Josh Dean.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that my constituents will have been horrified by Russia's conduct over Easter, not least the Ukrainian families that have found safety in our community. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that Russia's actions over the Easter weekend show that Ukraine is still very much in a fight against Russian aggression, that they deserve our fullest support, and will he take this opportunity to reassure the Ukrainian families in my community that that is exactly what Ukraine will have?
Secretary of State.
Well, I pay tribute to my honourable friend's community and the welcome and that they've shown to Ukrainian families that are part and parcel of their community now. And I hope his constituents and the Ukrainians amongst them will be reassured by the strength of the cross-party support in the House this afternoon for their continued fight and for our determination to try and secure with them a long-term peace.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the reports that the US have withdrawn intelligence sharing with Ukraine, does the Defence Secretary believe that's an exaggeration? And if not, does he believe the UK and the coalition of the willing, trusted partners in that coalition of the willing, can do a workaround on intelligence sharing?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there was a moment when intelligence sharing with Ukraine was paused. That was restarted with the momentum behind the talks and the point at which Ukraine and the US were back on the same page. I'm proud to say the UK played a part in doing that, and those arrangements are an important part of Ukraine being able to withstand the onslaught from President Putin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To support our Ukrainian friends, we need a robust, sovereign industrial base. Now, one proposal to help finance this and enhance supply chain security is the creation of a multilateral armament bank, such as the proposed Defence, Security and Resilience Bank. Does the Minister agree with me that the Government should explore this potentially game-changing solution?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, yes, I do agree with my honourable friend, and we are. It is part of the preparation for the defence industrial strategy, because we want to find ways of maximising the investment, going to British firms and British jobs, making a contribution, important contribution, not just to the defence and security of our own country, but those of our allies as well.
Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And rightfully, this House spends a lot of time talking about Russia, but of course Russia can't act without Belarus. Would the Secretary of State update us of the discussions in terms of what Belarus's role has been in this case, and also whether that was discussed in his meetings he's recently had?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, to be quite honest with the honourable gentleman, Belarus was not discussed. It's Russia that is doing the active invasion and the attacks. Belarus is certainly an ally of President Putin, but they're not active participants in this attack on Ukraine.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In his statement, the Secretary of State was right to link the record level of spending on Ukraine with the opportunity for UK industry. But I'm sure he'd agree that this opportunity is also a challenge, both for scale-up of the industry and also, as we've heard, for the development cycle for new technologies as well. In addition to the support for innovation, and as we've also heard on financing, Could he share whether the Department are considering additional measures to support our supply chains to build capability so that organisations like our own defence cluster in Teesside can help to take their rightful place in supporting both Ukraine and the UK?
Secretary of State.
We are indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, because my honourable friend is completely right, and his long experience in industry bears this out, that having a productive capacity which is sovereign and in the UK is one thing, but if that can't be supplied by the essential components and materials required, then the strategic strength is undermined, and we're very conscious of that as we develop a new defence industrial strategy. One, Madam Deputy Speaker, we haven't had in this country since the one produced in 2021.
Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for his statement. But can he set out what recent steps have been taken by the government to support the Ukrainian Prosecutor General in investigating and prosecuting domestic war crimes?
Secretary of State.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Speaker will be aware of this from his recent visit to Ukraine, in particular to Bucha, and the Honourable Gentleman will know that from the outset the UK Government, under the previous regime and this one, has continued to support, with legal expertise and funding where it's helpful, the evidence gathering and potential case building that I hope will lead to the prosecutions that he also wants to see.
Cameron Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State spoke of sending a clear signal to Vladimir Putin. I do hope that his US counterpart won't take that too literally. I would, regardless, prefer to be sending drones the way of President Zelensky. £25 billion in frozen Russian assets would buy an awful lot of drones. I hear what he's saying, but I plead with him to take the lead on this and let the Ukrainians win in their finest hour.
Secretary of State.
Deputy Speaker, I hear what he says. I hope he heard what I said in response to his front bench spokeswoman on that.
Ben Obsujecti.
Media reports and statements from representatives of the US administration in recent days have suggested various options for Ukraine's post-war borders, many of which see the ceding of Ukrainian sovereign territory. I appreciate the Defence Secretary will not want to comment on media speculation, but given his commitment to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, ahead of those talks tomorrow, what are the government's red lines regarding any peace proposal from the US's mediator that recognises occupied Ukrainian territory as Russian? And I include Crimea within that scope.
Secretary of State.
I'm sorry to disappoint the honourable gentleman. He cites media reports and then says that he doesn't expect me to comment on them, and I won't.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, I welcome the fact that the government has once again stood firm with Ukraine as they fight to defend their territory and send a message to dictators that you cannot change borders by military force. But he has been asked twice already today. We're giving £21 billion worth in munitions, etc., to Ukraine. But there are billions of assets, Russian assets, which were seized as part of the sanctions we imposed in that regime, and we haven't got an answer from him yet. What progress is being made on that? And does he not fear, like me, that given the transactional nature of the way in which President Trump approaches these negotiations, these assets could become part of the negotiations, Russia could hold on to them and avoid the sanctions and avoid paying for the carnage that they've caused in Ukraine?
Well, as I said to the honourable lady who speaks for the Liberal Democrats, work is going on with allies on that question of the Russian allies' assets. I'll just say to him, look, our first focus at the Ukraine Defence Contact Group was what can we do now, what can we do quickly, what can we do in order to keep Ukraine in the fight today, because it's important that we don't jeopardise the prospects of peace by forgetting about the war, and that's where the 21 billion euros of a record level of commitment came from that meeting in Brussels 10 days ago.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much.
It better be good.
It better be good. I'll think of something quick. Madam Deputy Speaker, I return to the question of fishing, and it's right that we draw together with our European allies to fight and bring this war to an end. However, it cannot be right for the French to leverage in fishing negotiations for defence spending. Will the Secretary of State press on the Prime Minister the need to defend our fragile coastal communities and make clear to Paris that this cannot be helicopters for haddock, it cannot be mackerel for missiles?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was worth waiting for, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Look, my first focus as Defence Secretary is securing a defence and security agreement, and seeing that as the passport to British firms, more British jobs, as we can play our part in some of the Europe-wide procurement programmes and industrial developments we need to see.
Can I thank the Defence Secretary for his statement? I'll allow a few moments for the front benches to swap over. Which brings us to the statement on the For Women Scotland Supreme Court ruling. Minister for Women and Equalities, Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I will now make a statement to update the House on the Supreme Court judgment in the case for Women Scotland Limited versus the Scottish Ministers. This ruling brings welcome clarity and confidence for women and service providers. Single-sex spaces must be protected. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is personal to me. Before I was elected to this place, I ran a women's refuge in the North East for women and children fleeing domestic violence. I know how important it is, and always was to survivors, to have single-sex spaces based on biology, places of safety after trauma, time in a sanctuary which allowed them therapeutic support, healing from unimaginable male violence and fear. I remember, Madam Deputy Speaker, how hard countless campaigners had to fight over many decades to get any single-sex provision at all, to create women's refuges and to create rape crisis centres. And then later I remember how hard it was to convince commissioners that young homeless women trying to heal from terrifying acts of cruelty shouldn't be left in mixed-sex accommodation. I will continue to fight for that provision to ensure that women's safety, women's privacy and women's dignity is always protected. This government will continue as before, working to protect single-sex spaces based on biological sex, now with the added clarity of this ruling. And we will continue our wider work with commitment, with compassion, to protect all of those who need it right across society. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a government that will support the rights of women and trans people, now and always. This is a government that will support the rights of all people with protected characteristics, now and always. This is a government that will support the rights of our most vulnerable, now and always. And on that, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no change to announce. Dignity and respect for all, now and always. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a judgment long in the making. It began in 2018, when Scottish ministers issued guidance on the definition of a woman in the eyes of the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act. That guidance stated that a woman in that Act bears the same meaning as a woman in the Equality Act 2010 and included trans women with a gender recognition certificate. For Women Scotland challenged this guidance, saying that sex in the Equality Act means biological sex, so that a trans woman with a gender recognition certificate is a man for the purposes of the Act. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and last week the court ruled that sex in the Equality Act means biological sex. This means that a person will be considered as their biological sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, regardless of whether or not they have a gender recognition certificate. I know that the women who brought this challenge have not always been treated with the respect that they deserve. And this government believes in freedom of speech, and we believe in the fundamental right to protest. But in no way does that extend to criminal damage. There can be no excuse for defaced statues of feminist icons, no excuse for threats, no excuse for harassment. Madam Deputy Speaker, such acts seek to drag down the debate away from common sense, away from the sensible view held by the majority of the British public that women need single-sex spaces, that those spaces should be protected, and that you can protect those spaces while treating trans people with respect as well. So the certainty that this judgment brings is welcome. And now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is time to move forward. There's now a need to ensure that this ruling is clear across a range of settings, from healthcare and prisons to sport and single-sex support groups. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, as Britain's equality regulator, is working quickly to issue an updated statutory code of practice to reflect this judgment, and I look forward to reviewing that code of practice in due course. And Madam Deputy Speaker, alongside these updates, our work to protect single-sex spaces across society continues in earnest. Because for far too long, under the Conservative government, single-sex spaces were anything but, and nowhere is that clearer than in our hospitals. Year after year, the party opposite pledged to close mixed-sex wards, and yet year after year, their use not only persisted, it grew massively. And year after year, often in their most vulnerable moments, women were denied the privacy and the dignity that they deserved. Time after time, Conservative ministers, including the now leader of the opposition, came to this House and toured television studios telling the public that they were protecting single-sex spaces in our hospitals. Madam Deputy Speaker, the truth was very, very different, because as last year's data tells us, the use of mixed-sex wards rose by over 2,200%, 2,200% in 10 years under the last Tory government. There is no better example of this, of rhetoric divorced from reality, of a party playing politics with the safety of women, and we will never let them forget it. Madam Deputy Speaker, by contrast, this government will protect women's wards, and NHS England will soon publish guidance on how trans patients should be accommodated in clinical settings, and we will end the practice of mixed-sex wards once and for all. It is not just in our NHS that we will act on behalf of women. In prisons, we will continue to protect women's safety with single-sex accommodation. In women's sport, I've always backed integrity and fairness. Biology matters for competitive sport, and sporting bodies have issued rules to reflect this. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in our prisons, in our hospitals, in sport, in a whole host of other spaces, what was true before the ruling remains true after the ruling. This government protects safe spaces for women under the Equality Act 2010. And for too many years, we've seen the heat dialed up on this debate by the party opposite, with no real action to protect women's spaces. While the use of mixed-sex wards increased under their watch, while an epidemic of violence against women and girls spread across the country, while women's health was neglected, this Labour government will deliver for women through our plan for change, driving down waiting lists month after month, tackling misogyny throughout society, and once and for all, delivering justice for survivors of violence against women and girls. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know as well that many trans people will be worried in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling. So I want to provide reassurance here and now that trans people will continue to be protected. We will deliver a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. We will work to equalise all existing strands of hate crime, and we will review adult gender identity services so that all trans people get the high-quality care that they deserve. The laws to protect trans people from discrimination and harassment will remain in place, and trans people will still be protected on the basis of gender reassignment, a protected characteristic written into Labour's Equality Act. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government will offer trans people the dignity that too often they were denied by the party opposite. Too often, a convenient punch bag. Too often, the butt of jokes made in this place by the party opposite, culminating rather shamefully in the previous Prime Minister standing at this dispatch box trying to score cheap laughs from his backbenchers at the expense of vulnerable people. By contrast, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is clear. Trans people deserve safety, they deserve opportunity, and they deserve respect. Madam Deputy Speaker, this verdict is about clarity and coherence in the eyes of the law. But the Supreme Court judges delivered along with that verdict a vital reminder. This isn't about the triumph of one group at the expense of another. It's not about winners or losers. It's not about us or them. And that is the message that I want to reinforce here today in this House. Everyone in our society deserves dignity and respect. Those values are not and never will be a zero-sum battle. Dignity and respect for all. Those are the values that lift us up and set us free. Those are the values that define and distinguish any modern and compassionate society. And those are the values, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this government will do everything to promote and protect now and always. And I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement, even if it was mostly a shameless work of fiction. I could not believe my eyes or my ears this afternoon. In 2021, the Prime Minister said it is not right to say only women have a cervix. In 2022, he said it is the law that trans women are women. In 2023, he said, and I quote, 99% of women don't have a penis. I know what a woman is, and I always have. The people of this country know what a woman is. We didn't need the Supreme Court to tell us that, but this government did. A Labour government so desperate to jump on a bandwagon that they abandoned common sense, along with the SNP, who put rapists in women's prisons, and, of course, the Liberal Democrats. The Supreme Court ruling is a powerful victory for the determined women behind For Women Scotland and for people all over the UK who know how important it is to give privacy and dignity to women and girls who need it. But it follows years of battle. Individual women took action to uphold the law at great personal cost, losing their jobs and their reputations. A few weeks ago, I met the Darlington nurses who have been forced to bring legal action after a male nurse started using their changing room. Even their union, the Royal College of Nursing, refused to represent them. Women should not have to battle the NHS or their employers through the courts. Why has it been such a battle? Because something as simple as biological reality became politicised and corrupted by activists pushing this ideology as foolish politicians cheered. Even the Secretary of State, who said that this is personal to her, stated just last year that men should access women's spaces. Whether it is female victims in our courts being forced to refer to their male sex attackers as she, or the NHS using confusing gender-neutral language, putting the health of women at risk, this is a serious matter. At every point, we have fought for women. We faced hostility from activist groups and those opposite. In 2020, when we rejected Labour's calls to introduce self-ID, or in 2021, when the then Home Secretary, the member for Whittam, ordered police forces to stop recording offences by trans women in female crime statistics. The current Culture Secretary said that crimes committed by men should be recorded how they wish, that those convicted of serious sexual offences should be held in jails that match their chosen gender. It was crazy then, and it is crazy now. I spent years battling abuse from Labour MPs as I fought to uphold biological sex in government, and as I blocked the SNP introducing their mad self-identity laws. I will take no lectures from them on what to do on this issue. Women and gay rights groups like the LGB Alliance were even refused stands at the Labour Party conference. The idea that they have supported this all along is for the birds. The Foreign Secretary described opponents of self-ID as dinosaurs. Labour now says that they know what a woman is and that transgender people should use services and facilities designated to their biological sex. They've never said this before. This is a U-turn, but we welcome it. Now that we have legal clarity, will the Prime Minister show some courage and do the right thing? Will he apologise to the member for Canterbury, who faced so many security concerns as she was hounded out by the Labour Party and was rebuked by the Prime Minister and many Labour MPs sitting there looking at me for stating what the Supreme Court has now ruled to be true? Will she apologise to the member for Canterbury? I doubt it. Will the Prime Minister crack down on the groups we saw defacing statues of suffragists over the weekend with the same energy he reserves for his political opponents? Or will we see more two-tier justice? Because the last time we saw Labour MPs standing next to them with no rebuke whatsoever. Will the Secretary of State ensure that the EHRC has the government's full support in its enforcement of the Code of Practice, and in particular, will she condemn those Labour ministers who described Baroness Faulkner's entirely correct position on the judgment as appalling? Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to root out gender ideology from our institutions. This government now has a serious job to do, as many organisations will still fail women. So I ask the following. As Minister for Women and Equalities, I published guidance for schools that made clear that toilets and changing rooms must be provided separately for girls and boys. She scrapped that guidance. Will she stand up to the unions and urgently publish what she now admits is the law? She also scrapped RHSE guidance to prevent schools from teaching contested gender ideology as fact. Will she now publish this guidance and remove materials that misstate the law? Will she act to stop passports and licences being issued with self-declared rather than legal sex? Will the government support our amendments to the data bill to ensure digital ID systems record biological sex accurately? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I heard the Secretary of State. She says that she is here to protect transgender people. Many of them were misled by Labour's misstatements on this issue. Some are now left very anxious. She has not provided any reassurance, and she should not use them as a shield to protect her failure. This isn't the end of the matter, but the beginning of the end. There is so much to do, and the Conservative Party, under my leadership, will be relentless in ensuring the government does the right thing.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted to see the Right Honourable Lady in her place today. Many would run from a record like hers on these matters, but not the Right Honourable Lady. She and the party opposite had 14 years to provide clarity on the issues they now claim to take an interest in. And the Supreme Court confirmed that Labour's Equality Act is the basis for single-sex spaces and protection. But they didn't, Madam Deputy Speaker, they didn't provide that clarity. But before I turn and say a bit more about the Right Honourable Lady's record, I'll say a little bit more about mine. I will come to the questions. If the Right Honourable Lady would have some patience, I will respond to her questions. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have supported countless women and children fleeing appalling male violence, sexual violence and domestic abuse. I have campaigned for decades on women's rights. I know more than most the importance of spaces for women. I fought for them, I delivered them, I ran them. And during my time running that refuge, while Labour was delivering the groundbreaking Equality Act, which this ruling confirms sets in law the basis for single-sex spaces, what was the Leader of the Opposition doing? She was busy hacking the website of the leading architect of the Equality Act, forever the keyboard warrior. And she's learned nothing from her party's crushing electoral defeat last year. She held the post of Minister for Women and Equalities for 2 years and did precisely nothing, provided no clarity in the law and nothing to improve the lives of women, which got materially worse on her watch. She comes here claiming to speak for women, but let's look at her record and her party's record. An increase in stalking offences, prosecutions and convictions for domestic abuse nearly halved since 2015. The rape charge rate at a record low. Survivors of sexual violence waiting years for justice. A 2,000% increase in the use of mixed-sex wards in over 10 years. That is their record, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in terms of the questions that she asks about the Equality and Human Rights Commission and their statutory code of conduct, their statutory code of practice. I have set out that I'm expecting an updated version of that as quickly as is possible. I will work with the Equality and Human Rights Commission to implement that code of practice to make sure that everyone has the clarity that they require, and I expect the EHRC to work quickly and thoroughly on this matter. Madam Deputy Speaker, she asks about gender questioning guidance and she asks about RSHE guidance. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid that's just another area that is simply laughable. Merely months before the election was called, they published a version of the draft guidance for gender questioning children. And since that time, we had the final review published by Dr. Hilary Cass. It is right that we ensure that that guidance aligns with Dr. Cass's final review. And on the RSHE guidance, that consultation concluded after the election. We couldn't be clearer, Madam Deputy Speaker. We will always protect single-sex spaces, and on this side of the House, we are focused on delivering for women.